For several weeks now, we'll be hanging out in the book of John, according to the lectionary and kind of guiding our way. There's several texts that are based upon and in this text of Jesus feeding the multitudes that have gathered around him and offer to them the bread of life. It's funny. I can get the people who gathered idea. I mean, there are times in which I have been kind of hungry. You know, when you expected supper to be at 5 o'clock and it wound up being at 9:30 that night, those kind of things. I mean, I've had a good life and I'm lucky like that. And I realize that and I give God thanks. But I also realize that there is kind of this longing and hungering, and I can kind of sort of empathize a little bit with those who truly were hungry in Jesus' day. I mean, it's really a basic human nature. To hunger is something that really happens to us in so many ways, not only about food. We hunger, especially in these times when we're separated from contact with our family and with our friends. We hunger and wait for times in which we can gather to watch a major show or a concert, even to gather as a church family normally, not only separated with pews and distances, but the good old-fashioned hugs and handshakes that we once were able to do, that we stop and hesitate on just to protect one another just a bit more. Oh, you know, there's all kinds of things that you really just long for. I think that's part of what's here, and at least in the psyche and the understanding of those who've gathered around. But perhaps there is a real physical understanding of hunger. And somehow Jesus feeds them. Those miracles are things that we really, in our rational mind, in our 21st century mind, in which we have to have answers to every question in the world and on some authority, and then when we get it, we kind of wonder about it. Is it true? Is it what I really know? Is it what I want to understand? I mean, we do that, and that's part of this whole scientific enlightenment. There's got to be a reason behind everything, and we've got to know it. Although we know a lot of stuff in our individual lives about individual talents and techniques, we don't know everything about everything, despite what we sometimes tell ourselves. And yet Jesus is there in front of those folks who've gathered around him, and they're hungry, and he offers to them bread to feed them. Not only do they go on to want to make him king and ruler, they want to stay with him all the time. And why not? I mean, it's like being on a vacation. It's just perfect. You know, it's one of those things, it's an all-you-can-eat buffet back when we could have buffets. You can just go and get as much as you want, and you don't really have to do anything. Just get a clean plate. You know, it's just good stuff. And yet, how do you feel after one of those, if you can remember back that far, after one of those all-you-can-eat buffets, how do you feel? Oh my Lord, I am going to have to get my stretchy jeans out. I'm going to take a nap for a week and a half. I can't move. I can barely breathe. You know, too much of a good thing really can be not such a good thing. And that's really what they perhaps were wanting, is just to be full and fed and to be given everything in life. I don't know about you, but growing up, I was always given an allowance, a little bit of extra my own money. Between working with my granddad at the store, and he would give me a little bit of money, and Mom and Dad, I'd have to vacuum the house on Friday afternoon before Mama got home. I could watch cartoons up until 3:30, I think it was. Get home from the bus, I could watch cartoons or whatever I wanted to on TV, and you wouldn't believe, oh my Lord, I hope Mom and Dad aren't watching this morning. You wouldn't believe I could vacuum that whole house in 20 minutes. That was quick. It was like a speed racer. I knew exactly which plug to hit on the vacuum cleaner, and I could get it done, and I could get my money, and I could still watch a little TV after I finished. Because that's what I wanted. And yet, when I got my money together and I could, you know, there's some of those bigger toys or bigger items that you wanted, and you kind of have to save up, and you have to save up, and you have to save up. And then you look at all this money. I think that's and even, you know, those analysis of how we spend and personal finance gurus, they tell us if we pay cash for stuff, we would buy a whole lot less, and I'm guilty as charged by not. But when I had all that cash in my hand and would go and look at that, I don't know what it was, some toy that was $22.06. We could buy Matchbox cars that were metal for $1. I remember it. I would get one. Grandpa would give me $1. We'd go to the mall. I'd go get a whole Matchbox, a new one, metal, for $1. But when you saved up all that money and you went to go buy that, and you're like, do I really want to let go of this? Probably the kid in us went out most of the time and they're like, yep, sure do. I'll get some more of this later. Get ready for it. And those are things that we enjoyed, but we had to save up for it. We had to wait. We had to anticipate. Christmas morning, I was an only child. Santa Claus never forgot where I lived. My mother, I still believe in Santa Claus. My mom told me long ago, she said, when you stop believing in Santa Claus, he stops coming to see you. So I believe in Santa Claus because I know that the gift and the spirit is real. Santa Claus came down my chimney, brought a load of toys, and I'd wake up in the morning and it would all be there for me. And there's just not enough hours in the day to play with all that stuff and to remember it. And it kind of came and then it went. Those things that I bought with my money and I took care of, and some of them I still have the toys, and some of them I still have the boxes with the toys. I'm a little neurotic. Y'all have seen my office. Might need that someday. But we challenged that and we held it and valued it. You know how it is with people. They're passing out notes and on the sidewalk, and you get one and you look at it for half a second, and back when we could do that, and you crumble it up in your hand and throw it into the nearest trash can. You just don't really pay attention to it. It's not something that's valued, but somebody writes you a handwritten note with a name, address, signed on it. You save it. I've got several in my desk drawer that are just cherished. Folks have written, when I feel a little discouraged, I get them up and they lift them. They're valuable to me. Not something that comes along every day and not something that just shows up. Usually there's a response, an effort. Not just some pre-printed, mass-produced something that shows up. Those who gather around Jesus, they're happy that they've gotten their fill. They want to keep doing it. And yet at the same time, Jesus says that's not really what it's about. It's not about having everything It's not about everything, getting it all at one time. I always love beautiful roses. We've got some in our arrangement today that's just beautiful. But roses that are these beautiful flowers that smell delicious, but are full of thorns. That's kind of how things work. Not just handed to us, not just given to us. Yet, these people who've gathered around Jesus want this bread, they want this fill. They might be Methodist. They're ready to eat. They might be. And yet Jesus says at the same time, I am the bread of life, not this stuff that you're putting in your stomach. I am the bread of life. It's always interesting when we talk about communion, and we're going to celebrate it today, and it's going to be different with the little cups and the little juice, but still the symbolism and the power and the ability of God's Spirit to work in and through that as a deliverer of God's grace is present and powerful. But when we talk about the fulfillment and the sustaining of communion in our lives, to a person on the outside who had never experienced it, who hadn't enjoyed it, who hadn't experienced the love of God and the presence of grace in their life, would look at us and laugh over this styrofoam wafer and this little bit of grape juice that's been prepackaged and say that's not a fulfilling meal. That's funny. And yet those of us who've been on the path and the journey realize and understand and know and have experienced the fullness of Christ coming into our lives. These little bitty waters of baptism that are placed on our head and over our body or onto our body is a reminder of God's grace being given to us. It's a mark and a seal of God's claiming us into God's family, to welcoming us, to offer forgiveness, to include us into God's kingdom. These little waters that are just regular tap water until we pray over them. This little bit of bread and this little bit of juice is just regular old stuff until God's Spirit gets a hold of it and works God's ability and grace in and through that for us. Oh, it sustains us. Communion has long represented the presence of Christ in the world despite everything else that's going on. The disciples for the first thousands of years pictured him in artwork, gathered around the table, breaking the bread with God's family, being reminded of God's presence in that midst, despite what's going on. Yep. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. We don't know what yesterday fully meant until we've worked through it with our minds and our brains and our time. And yet we understand as people of faith that God is in our midst, present with us, to sustain us and strengthen us as God's people to go forth into the world. Oh, this little bread and this juice, I imagine most of you are going to get some lunch afterwards. It won't be enough physically to sustain you. But spiritually, it's much, much, much more to strengthen and to integrate itself into our life, to be reminded of taking into Christ into our lives and into our bodies, into our world. To look at it with the same eyes that Christ has, to look at other people, sometimes when we don't even like them very much, with the same eyes and the same mind and the same heart of Christ. Because just as we are God's creations, and we are created by God, and God called to be God's people, they are too. And through these waters of baptism, through this integration of the Spirit working in our lives, we're called to be their brothers and their sisters as well. Oh, this welcome table is so wonderful. I don't know, there are times in which I remember over the years, different times in which I've celebrated communion together with family and friends, when I've been connected to them at the same time when we receive the elements together, to value that and celebrate that. Times in which I remember sometimes some of those preacher types rubbed me the wrong way, the way they said something about communion. It just, there's just things, the things that make you twitch a little bit. And yet at the same time, it's not the preacher that's at work here, it's God. It's God's gift to us. And it's our gift to the world around us to share this God that has been given to us so freely with all that come in our presence. And so we, as God's people, gather around this table to celebrate the presence of God in the world and in our lives.